Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to Keeping It Local, a monthly series from September to April, hosted by the League of Women Voters of Champaign County, to focus on local issues with local experts as presenters. You can join us by Zoom at 7 p.m. on the fourth Wednesday of each month. Information about upcoming Keeping It Local programs is on our website, lwvchampaigncounty.org. I'm Teresa Michelson, a member of the program team that plans these presentations. Our topic this evening is water, and specifically the Mahomet Aquifer. It supplies water for more than 750,000 people, 100 communities, and innumerable farms and businesses. Currently, the aquifer faces a critical threat: pollution from carbon sequestration projects. Our two panelists have worked locally for years to advance clean and sustainable energy policies and will share their expertise on the Mahomet Aquifer and how we can help protect it. Let me introduce them. Andrew Rhen is the Climate Policy Director at Prairie Rivers Network. He works to develop and implement policies that advance clean energy in Illinois, while ensuring the fossil fuel industry does not leave behind a legacy of water and land pollution. He is passionate about water resources, energy policy, and coalition building. Andrew joined Prairie Rivers Network in 2015 after completing a master's in civil engineering at the University of Illinois. Pam Richart is a trained land use and environmental planner who coordinates the Eco-Justice Collaborative in Champaign. Established in 2007, EJC promotes climate solutions that integrate environmental, economic, and social justice. Pam served on the leadership team of the Downstate Caucus of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition until 2020. Recently, Pam has been instrumental in drafting, negotiating, and passing Illinois' 2024 Carbon Capture and Sequestration Protections Act. Before we turn the program over to Andrew and Pam, a few reminders. Please keep yourself muted. There will be 10 or 15 minutes after the presentation for questions. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. Carol Bosley and Ann Panthen will get to as many as possible. Andrew, Pam, it's to you.
Thanks, Teresa. Appreciate the introduction. Let me just start sharing my screen. Okay, so as you heard in the introduction, we're here today to talk about the Mahomet Aquifer. So what is the Mahomet Aquifer? An aquifer is water that is underground in a geological layer that typically, if we're calling something an aquifer, it means that we're able to get a good amount of water out of it. So below your feet right now, there's something called groundwater if you go far enough down. And that groundwater is just in the soil matrix. An aquifer is a layer of that, typically sand or gravel, that can hold a lot of water. And the Mahomet Aquifer is in the eastern portion is what's called a confined aquifer, meaning it's got an impermeable layer above it and below it. And in the western portion of the aquifer, it is a surface aquifer, meaning that rain that hits the ground will, some portion of that will typically trickle down into the aquifer itself. And this is the extent of the aquifer in the state. So it goes from sort of the Illinois-Indiana border, or at least what we call the Mahomet Aquifer, starts there, and it goes all the way west from there to the Illinois River. And it is the drinking water source for almost 1 million people in central Illinois. It has also been designated by the US EPA as a sole source aquifer. So this is a designation process that identifies that an aquifer does not have an economically viable alternative if the aquifer is compromised. And what's depicted here is called the project review area, which is part of that sole source designation. The whole hashed area is in the project review area. The major portion of it is what is the aquifer itself, and then the two smaller hashed areas are identified as recharge areas. So the Mahomet Aquifer, the work that Pam and I and others are doing really stands on the shoulders of giants. And this is true a lot of the time in environmental work. The Mahomet Aquifer was designated as a sole source aquifer in 2015 due to the efforts of a lot of folks, community members, local governments, folks who came together to speak up for the aquifer and against a project that was going to store dangerous waste in the Clinton landfill. So that fight culminated in 2015, both in a consent decree with the landfill and in the designation of the Mahomet Aquifer as a sole source aquifer. And so, like I said, a lot of times these environmental battles are incremental. And as you protect a precious environmental resource from one threat, that protection can then be leveraged in the future as a way to identify it as a precious resource and continue to protect it in the future. So thank you to anybody on the call who was involved in that fight back in 2015 to get the aquifer designated. That's right when I started at Prairie Rivers Network, and I was not involved in the effort, but it obviously has started our conversation around a precious resource. And today we're going to talk about another potential threat to the aquifer that needs to be addressed. So you've probably heard of carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon sequestration. The full process, carbon capture and sequestration, is where carbon is captured. It can be captured in any number of places. Oftentimes this is a fossil fuel power plant, like a coal plant or a gas plant. Sometimes it's ethanol. It can also be, there's something called direct air capture, which means just sucking it out of the atmosphere. That carbon is captured and isolated, and they get just the carbon. Then it is transported to a place where it would be stored long term. In this case, we're talking about sequestration as the method of storage. And it is often transported in a pipeline. And these pipelines are moving the CO2 through pipes that are close to the ground, not underground, but not too far underground. When it's sequestered, it's ultimately injected through an injection well that sends it deep underground. So the type of geological formation that they're looking to sequester carbon into is often saline aquifers. So an aquifer that is made up of salt water. In this case, in Illinois, they're aiming to put this carbon in the Mount Simon sandstone. That is, like I said, it's a saline aquifer. It's about a mile deep. The Mahomet is much closer to the surface, more like 500 feet below us. This raises a number of concerns for how carbon might get into the aquifer and then what it might do. So a couple leak pathways that we're identifying here. You can have leaks along the injection well. So the well to push the carbon underground. Failure, it could have a number of different failure mechanisms, and that could result in carbon seeping back up through the well and then getting into any number of regions that they don't want it, such as the Mahomet Aquifer. And in addition to injection wells, you also have things like so these are wells that are used to in the project to study. And I'm getting that my connect stable. So if my voice, let me know if I become inaudible, and I can pause for a moment. But monitoring wells are just used by these projects to identify, to kind of study and observe what's happening in their injection site. So the second mechanism would be cap rock failure. So this is sort of a geological. When they inject the carbon underground, they're looking for formations that look like a dome, because carbon wants to rise when it's underground. And so a dome-like feature would capture the carbon. But you might have a situation where that feature either is or fractured through the geological activity, such as or perhaps it was already fractured and it was not properly identified. That could result in carbon leaking up through the geological layers and getting into a drinking water source. And then the last pathway could be abandoned wells. So these are wells that aren't drilled by the carbon sequesterer, but are drilled by somebody else in the past. I mean, there are unknown wells out there that were drilled decades ago, and they may not have been fully closed properly, and therefore they could also remain a pathway. So those are kind of the ways that we might get exposure. And then the other side of this is identifying the risks of carbon exposure into a drinking water aquifer. So the first thing that's going to happen would be acidification. So you have CO2 entering the Mahomet Aquifer. Carbon mixes with water, forms carbonic acid. It also, that acid then lowers the pH of the water. So people joke about, oh, it's just bubbly water. Well, it's not just bubbly water. Changing your water chemistry can change what sort of chemicals are what the chemistry of the water is, changes what chemicals are dissolved in that water. So this is a list of the threats that have been identified by the Department of Energy, and acidification is one of them. Becoming saline, the carbon carrying saline water with it is another. But the last one is contaminating a drinking water source, a USDW, with toxic heavy metals that are caused by that change in chemistry. So you might have something that was stable at one point, and the change in water chemistry causes it to start becoming suspended in your water, and then it can start showing up in your drinking water as you pump it up. So those are the threat pathways we're concerned about. I'll talk a little bit about why we're talking about this now. On the left, you'll see a diagram. It's from a study that looked at where carbon sequestration could be sort of most effective in the Illinois basin. And the sweet spot, the place they identified that it would be most cost effective to store CO2 it happens to be right under the Mahomet Aquifer. So I've added the sort of the shadow of the Mahomet Aquifer here. And as you can see, it really lines up spot on with that red spot. So that's why these projects are starting to come here, why they're looking to do this in Illinois and specifically in areas around the aquifer. The other reason is one that we'll see what happens, but in 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and that increased the incentive for sequestering carbon to $85 a ton. And this made it economic enough for companies to start looking at doing this as a way to make money. And this $85 a ton is in the form of a tax credit. So if you sequester that carbon, you get a tax credit, and that can also be tradable. So it really made something that was marketable that would draw funding to do this. So that's kind of like why this is happening. Trump just got elected. He froze a bunch of funds from the Inflation Reduction Act. Technically, this isn't funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. It's funded by taxpayers because it's tax breaks for these companies. I actually tried to figure out where this stands right now, given that there were executive orders 2 days ago, and I'm not positive. So just like everything in the next whoever knows how long, we're going to be really trying to figure out what is happening and what the impacts of a lot of changes in the federal level are going to be. But in the meantime, it seems like we're still need to be thinking about these projects coming here and potentially threatening the aquifer. So here are the projects that have been identified so far. You can see there are 4 that have been proposed that would be in the aquifer in its recharge area. And there's one project, ADM Maroa, which is, as far as we can tell, just outside the aquifer based on, sorry? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Based on looking at some GIS data, it looks like it's just outside. There's 4 projects. One of them, the Vault Dragon project, that looks like it's in Pekin, is pretty new, and so we actually don't have all the information about it. The application is kind of just started to, information about it has just started to show up on the US EPA's website. So the volumes of carbon that are being stored are, the One Earth project is looking at 90 million metric tons of CO2. The 2 Heartland projects are both 62.5. Maroa is 39 million metric tons. And we'll put this into perspective in a little bit, but these are big numbers. But also, if you remember, at $85 a ton and 90 million metric tons, we're looking at billions of dollars in tax breaks over the lifetime of these projects. So let's look a little bit at the scale of the projects that are being proposed. This is everything in Illinois. And at the top, you can see the ADM pilot project. So you'll hear a lot more about this from Pam in a little bit, but ADM has been running a pilot, a couple phases of a pilot project for carbon sequestration in Decatur for over a decade. And this has really been elevated as the sort of the shining example of carbon sequestration. And over that time period, they've stored 4.5 million metric tons. About that, it's I think more now, but they're storing every day. So that number will slowly change. What's proposed in kind of the coming onslaught of projects so far totals up to 458 million metric tons. So the scale of what we're talking about is far and away larger than what's been done before. And if you just narrow that down to projects that would be below the Mahomet Aquifer and its recharge area, we're looking at about 50 times the volume that has ever been sequestered. So the scale of this is really new. And these projects storing carbon, the idea is that it's stored for forever. So when we look at a scale this large and a project that long, it really starts to feel like this pilot project isn't necessarily representative of what carbon sequestration is going to do. And the Mahomet Aquifer should really not be the laboratory where we're testing new scales of carbon sequestration. So that is sort of the suite of threats. And I think Pam is going to take over here and talk a little bit about existing regulation.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you all. And by now you're probably saying to yourselves, aren't there any regulations that exist to help protect us? Well, there are, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of them. First of all, at the federal level, in 2010, 2011, the federal government adopted a Class 6 well permit process that was really put in place for Future Gen, which many of you here may remember that project that cost the federal government $1 billion or more, and thought that would be the way to go, the wave of the future to capture and store carbon, and it didn't work. But yes, the Class 6 permit was put in place for that. And the US EPA does administer this permit process via the Safe Drinking Water Act. So their concern and their focus is really on keeping our water safe, which is a good thing. As part of that process, which many will say is rigorous, and it is fairly rigorous, there's a lot of site characterization, a lot of geologic monitoring that has to be done, evaluation of seismic activity, looking at where the wells are that might provide pathways for leaks. They have to do monitoring. They have an emergency plan requirement. They have to do reporting to the EPA every year and more. So all that is good. However, we know that for the last at least 2 years, maybe more, industry has been pushing the Biden administration to actually relax those standards. That hasn't happened yet. But given the fact that the CCS process seems to be having such great incentives, we don't really know what's going to happen to these federal protections in the future with the Trump administration, and we're all going to be keeping our eye on that. What is fairly strong today may stay strong, or it may be modified as we go forward. But in addition to that, as industry was coming into the state of Illinois, and it was and has been, as you've seen from the maps, there was an urgent need, I think, identified by many of us to actually make sure we had protections in place that were over and above the federal Class 6 permit process. So what we did here as a state is we passed a bill called the Safe CCS Act. That's the short version of its very long name. And it requires the Illinois EPA to administer a sequestration permit, and actually requires a developer to first go get their Class 6 well permit. Don't even pass go if you can't, come to our state if you can't do that first. And then we tried to put in additional requirements, many of which I think are of interest. One of those is to ensure that sequestration is not turned over to the state. It does not become a state liability as wells are closed. That's not the state's responsibility long term. There's a whole host of insurance requirements and financial assurances and requirements for that preclude self-bonding to make sure that those financial assurances remain strong over time. And there's also a few other things that I think are helpful. There's soil gas monitoring, air gas monitoring. There's an impact report that's required by the state, in addition to anything this Class 6 well process would require. There's non-consenting landowner protections and a big, huge win, which shouldn't have been such a big win, but the standards for how long a company is required to take care of a project after it's closed seem to be diminishing. There's been a project that was approved recently in Region 5, which is where we're all located. That was just for 10 years. And if I recall correctly, a 4-year timeline was proposed initially. So we have a minimum of 30 years, and that's great. And then most importantly, if there's a leak, and some of these provisions, if you read them carefully, you can see really imply that there could be a leak. So we have protections. What do you do if there is one? And one of those things is you gotta provide an alternative water supply. But the bill does not include the Mahomet Aquifer sequestration ban that we had hoped to see, despite requests from 12 Mahomet Aquifer legislators. The bill went through a process that was fast, and I don't think that there was enough time maybe to really give that ban due consideration, which is why we're here back now, trying to do it this time around. Thank you, Andrew. Next slide. So, as I said, the Safe CC Act requires the sequestration operator to provide an alternative supply of water. But guess what? If you have a US EPA sole source designation like we do here for the Mahomet, that means there is no reasonably available alternative drinking water sources should the aquifer become contaminated. And there are some guidelines that are put there on that designation, some percentages, et cetera. But I think for the Mahomet Aquifer, what's most important to understand is that the ability to replace the water is really an economic concern. It's been determined that it's economically not feasible to replace drinking water from either surface water sources or groundwater sources if, in fact, the aquifer were to experience contamination. And so there's a huge report that was done and submitted to the EPA as part of the petition. And the numbers you see here are lifted from that report. 92% of the public water suppliers, looking at service water availability, they determine that, the report determines that it's not economically feasible. Similarly, for groundwater source availability, 77% of the public water suppliers would not be able to economically replace the water if it were to be contaminated. Next, please. So by now we're kind of saying, okay, we have concerns, we have regulations. What can we expect as we go forward? And I think what our team has sort of realized is that we have lessons that we have learned by what could go wrong, even with the most stringent of the regulations that exist. And we have some lessons that I think we can take away from ADM. ADM, as Andrew said, is the showcase in the country of carbon sequestration. It is the only operating EPA-approved Class 6 well project in the entire country. They have just 2 injection wells and 2 monitoring wells. And if you look over on the right-hand side here, you can see the wells are in green and in orange, and they don't show up really well, but they're indicative of the location of the wells. They began sequestering and injecting carbon in 2011. Their pilot project was just 3 years, and they did successfully store 1 million metric tons of CO2, and they did learn some lessons that they applied to their commercial scale project, which is the second one and the one that leaked. The Illinois Industrial Carbon Capture and Storage Project, which began in 2017 and has stored an additional, probably more like 4 million metric tons of CO2 to date. But I will also say it's just half of what was promised, and we're not quite sure why that is. Next slide, please. So what happened? So ADM began injecting in 2017. By September of 2020, they realized their monitoring well was acting up. It had intermittent electrical failures. And so between January 2022 and December of that same year, they they tried really hard to address those malfunctions. There was a leak, and because of the leak in 2022, they partially plugged the well, which means that well at that time was no longer monitoring and taking samples out of all 5 zones. By October, after a lot of continued attempts to restore the well, they finally decided to plug the well, take out what they call its completion assembly, and then they took it out of production after they identified the well had corroded. So now they're operating with just one of 2 required monitoring wells. In June, EPA inspected all the wells. There's a gap there. All the reports that they're required to post are not all yet available online. So I'm jumping ahead to June. By August, EPA issued a notice of violation, and many remember it was in September when the story broke about ADM's monitoring well leak that they discovered in March. So the EPA then did the notice of violation, and then they followed that with an administrative order on consent, which essentially says, here's what you have to do. You have to agree to do to address the problem. We have a whole host of questions. There's a whole host of things you need to do. And when they were doing some of those required activities, they discovered there was a second leak in a different monitoring well. And it was at that point they stopped injecting CO2. But again, I want to emphasize they operated for a full year with just one of 2 required monitoring wells. And then as it continued, the story continues, ADM identified 24 wells that are above the cap rock. The CO2 is now above the cap, and those wells can serve as escape routes. Now, before I want to go any farther, I do want to say that ADM clearly says at no time was drinking water in any danger of being contaminated. And I also want to say that the leak that happened was not a large leak, but I think it does show leaks can happen, and it did, and not just once, but twice within 7 years. Next slide. So I think that we can learn the lesson here that even though we had the best available technology, the technology that was used allowed CO2 to go from the Simon Formation, where it was being stored, through the well because the sleeve stuck open because of the electrical issues that they had, and also probably the corrosion as well, enter the well and come up on top of the cap on the other side into the unauthorized area called the Ironton Galesville Formation that's above the cap. They used 13 chrome steel, which everybody thought was going to be really terrific. It's a stronger steel than is typically used for oil and gas pipelines, but we've learned it corrodes in the saline aquifer. They did not follow their emergency plan. They kept injecting CO2 when their emergency plan said, you've got a well malfunction, a major malfunction, and I would say they did. They closed down the well. They should have stopped injecting. And then here, I think this is really important. I would call this a moral failure. What happened is that as this leak was becoming known to them, they were also negotiating with the governor's team for the CCS bill. They were meeting with the city of Decatur to talk about storing CO2 under Lake Decatur as part of their expansion. And there was no notification to anybody. Everybody stayed silent. EPA stayed silent, and so did ADM. And on July 18th, Governor Pritzker stood a half mile away from the leaking well and signed the bill. So I think that the lack of notification was another big failure we ought to identify. Next slide, please. And there were EPA failures. They approved the project with material flaws, right? The design had flaws. The 13 chrome steel had flaws. They did not issue a notice of violation when they should have. When the well was taken out of production, they never required the company to stop injecting, as was required by their EPA-approved emergency plan. They waited until August of 2024 to issue a notice of violation, and September of October 2024 to issue that proposed order on consent. And they never told ADM to stop injecting CO2. CO2. I think that was a major failure. Next slide, please. So what we've learned here is that even though we have regulations that are stringent in place, and we have a supplemental CCS set of guidelines and regs that are here and approved by the state of Illinois, there's still a lot of uncertainty. There's still a lot of places where things can go wrong. Even the EPA acknowledges that, well, there's an inherent level of uncertainty in the early stage of any injection project. As they start to figure things out, that uncertainty is going to go away, and they'll be able to validate their model. So we need to remember that as we go into these types of projects, that some of this is a lesson learned along the way. And we're here to say, we don't think those lessons learned should be under the Mahomet Aquifer. And as Andrew said earlier, this aquifer should not be considered a laboratory for a corporate interest here. Next slide, please. And then we have another couple examples here. All of you who live in the area know about the Peoples gas leak. There's just one natural gas storage reservoir under the Mahomet, and guess what? It leaked. And Peoples Gas, knew the well was corroding as early as 1995, but did nothing until it was discovered by an employee in December of 2016. Now, CO2 and methane are not the same. They behave somewhat the same way, but how they relate with water and how they affect our drinking water is different. But it's another example of one, there was a leak, and two, the estimate of providing replacement water in 2020 was $10 million, and still people do not have replacement water. And there's another story in Livingston County that many of you probably have heard about too. So that is with Nicor gas. And Nicor has been storing gas in Ancona and nearby Garfield since the 60s. And in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, residents were saying it was leaking. There's been lawsuits, put in place brought against Nicor gas. All these years later, it's still leaking, and it's bubbling up, and you can see it at the surface, and you can hear it, and you can go out there and see crop circles where the gas has damaged fields. And there's nothing they seem to be able to do. They just capture it and shove it back down the ground again. So residents again are having to live with that impact on their water. Next slide, please. So regulation is a risk and a ban is certain. And Andrew, it's now your turn, I think.
Thanks, ma'am. Yeah. So that kind of gets down to the point of it here is there are all these risk pathways that all create a way where we live in some future world where they've contaminated the aquifer. And the only way to avert that future is to just ban it. Under a sole source aquifer, it just doesn't make sense. The risk tolerance is zero. It's not a laboratory. If we discover 50 years in the future that it's all perfectly safe and fine, then we can unban it, because all bans are technically moratoriums, because all you have to do is pass another bill. So we really think that caution is the way to go when you're risking a sole source aquifer. And so that's what Pam and I and others have been up to for the last half year or longer, depending on what you're counting. So we're working with state legislators and to pass a ban, working with counties, working with cities, and we're working with individuals like you all. And we're working on EPA hearings that are coming up. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the legislative action. So last fall, Senator Faraci and Representative Ammons, who represent the Champaign-Urbana area, and Senator Faraci represents parts of Vermilion County as well, introduced a bill that would ban carbon injection through and storage under the Mahomet, under actually any sole source aquifer. In this case, sole source aquifer, there's only one in Illinois, so that is the Mahomet Aquifer. But recognizing that another aquifer may one day be designated as a sole source aquifer, the language was written to apply to sole source aquifers broadly. And other Senator Rose and Representative Schweizer have also introduced similar legislation in the fall. Senator Faraci's bill went to a hearing in the Senate where the concerns were raised by the Senate leader who said we needed to have more conversations. And so that's where that ended. Unfortunately, we did not get out of what's called committee. Bills have to pass through committee and then the Senate floor, House committee, House floor. So that's where it ended in the fall. And so we're going to be back in the spring session. It seems that Senator Faraci and Ammons are both interested in refiling their bill. And I believe Senator Rose and Representative Schweizer have both already filed bills that would ban sequestration under the aquifer. So we think this would be a great way to move forward. A ban at a state legislature would mean that we're done. The ban on the whole aquifer. Once that passes, we don't have to worry about having a county by county battle in which we have to pass a ban in 14 counties to fully protect the aquifer. But that's not all. We haven't just been focusing on the state level because we don't know if we're going to be able to win here. And so we're also keeping an eye on and doing a lot of work in counties. And so Pam's going to talk about that.
And some of you on this call are from some of these counties, and I'm glad to see you here tonight. So we are, in fact, trying to do what we can with resolutions. First, that call on the state to pass a ban. We think that our state, our General Assembly would feel a bit more pressure and recognize the importance of this if we get the cities and counties in that 14 county area to actually pass resolutions calling on the state to pass a ban. So we're actively engaged in that now, and you see the resolutions here that are listed. Those are some that are passed. There's others in process. And so if you are from a county or a municipality that is interested in taking this action, you can find a sample resolution on our website, protectthemahometaquifer.com. Go up to the tabs in the top and click on the action guide, and you'll see a whole menu of fact sheets and resolutions, etc. You can download. So consider that. And in addition to that, next slide, please. We are also encouraging counties to do what they can while we are working to get that legislative ban across the finish line to protect the aquifer from carbon sequestration at the local level. DeWitt County has already done it. Ford County just adopted their sequestration ban right before Thanksgiving. In fact, it was the day before Thanksgiving. They actually had their last hearing the day before Thanksgiving to get across the finish line. And Champaign is in process. And the first step that Champaign has done is to adopt a moratorium. And again, that gives the counties the time they need to, in fact, get their ordinances together to include a ban as an amendment to their zoning ordinance. And again, you can find a sample moratorium at that same location. But I did want to say something about counties and powers. One of the very first things we did as we began to come together to figure out what our strategies and tactics were going to be in this campaign was we met with an attorney, Professor Eric Freifogel, who is a professor of land use planning and zoning, and he studied this quite in detail and wrote an opinion essentially that says, yeah, counties can do this. Yes, they can do this. And the Champaign County State's Attorney has shared its opinion and essentially says that they believe that the moratorium would likely survive any challenges that would be in court. So what we're proposing here is, yes, ban it where it would affect the Mahomet Aquifer, but allow it elsewhere so that you're not caught in a position where a county is being accused of doing an outright ban and not making it feasible to follow along with a carbon capture and sequestration permit. But that would be by special use, and the special use criteria can be really stringent to make sure that nothing gets approved without having adequate protections at the local level. So I would encourage you to look at that as you think about how you can play in your in this "what can I do" arena. This is in your toolkit, and you can find it right there on our website. Next slide, please. And tomorrow, guess what? I think Andrew said this already. We're going to be back in Champaign County. And we want to be there to celebrate what we expect to happen, that they will take their moratorium that's been through a pretty long process that began in August, and we think they're going to pass it tomorrow night. And again, what we want to emphasize here as we go make public comments, because there is a public comment period, and you can come and make a comment. The Mahomet Aquifer is not a laboratory, and I think that needs to be a sign. Our aquifer is not your experiment or not your laboratory. We'll come up with something like that, I think, for a sign. And again, remember that the sole source aquifer designation means we do not have other options to replace that water. It's an economic consideration here. And a moratorium is great, but we're going to be working towards that ban. Okay, Andrew, next slide.
Yeah, I think I'm the next slide, but I will say, if you can make it to this, please turn out. It would be great to pack the room. These signs that you see on this bench, we'll have those available if you want to have a sign to bring into the room with you. For Friday, we're with our fingers crossed already planning a celebratory happy hour at 25 o'clock. So if you live in the Champaign-Urbana area and would like to celebrate with us at 4 p.m., we're going to be going to 25 o'clock to celebrate this work. It's been a long process for the Champaign County Board. I think Pam and I have been there 3 or 4 times already. So we're glad that this is the one that counts, even though we've been there a bunch. And so we want to make sure that the county board members, some of which have never heard discussion about this yet, and they have not been at the public meetings, hear from all of you and hear that this is something that the public really wants to protect their water.
And just quickly on that note, I will say I have it firsthand from a really good source that having the public come and make comments really does make a difference. So I'm going to echo what Andrew said. If you can come, know you're coming and not coming just because it's the end of the process, it will make a difference. And this is, as Andrew also said, the final act. Sorry about that.
No,
Makes a difference. Show up.
Oh, no, this is you. Go ahead.
Oh, it's me again. Oh, the other thing that we're doing is, as Andrew started in his presentation, and he made comments about the Clinton landfill in DeWitt County, and as that process came together, and as people worked together to protect the aquifer and get its sole source designation, a Mahomet Aquifer Advocacy Alliance, now known as MA3, was formed. And so one of the things that we've been doing with our team is connecting with former officials who are part of that alliance and looking at ways to get them engaged. And so theoretically, if all goes well, we will have our first meeting of the Mahomet Aquifer Advocacy Alliance, MA3, early this month. It's tentatively scheduled for February 4th. And from there, we'll talk about, again, what they can do at the local level via resolution, via county ban, and especially important to talk to their state reps and state senators about passing this ban. So that's really important. So we're recatalyzing and re-engaging folks who historically have cared and taken action to protect the aquifer.
And lastly, there's what you can do. So you've already heard about the Champaign County Board meeting. If you live in the Champaign area, I know that perhaps some folks are joining from outside the Champaign-Urbana area. You can also sign our petition calling for a ban. It's at protectthemahomet.com/sign the petition. If you go to the website, you'll be able to find it. If you want to scan this QR code we've got on the right, you can scan this. This slide will be up for another few moments. You can help us by following and supporting Eco Justice Collaborative, where Pam works, and Prairie Rivers Network, where I work. Follow us, hear from us, donate. These things really help the work that we do. And we're also working on a business owner sign-on letter. So we think that the governor would benefit from hearing from businesses that value and want to protect their water, which is key to their business. So if you are a business owner and you'd like to sign on to that letter, send me an email. I've got my email here on the slide, and let us know, and we can talk about what that looks like, and you can see the letter, and we can discuss that. So these are just some individual actions we wanted to leave you with, and I think that is our last slide. So definitely consider helping out, coming on Thursday, and I think Pam and I are happy to take some questions.
All right. Thank you so much. What an informed and very straightforward presentation. I think for some of us, it was the first time we heard about this, but it was excellent. And I hope it really activates people to do some of these things that you would like them to do. Carol, and the questions in the chat, something you want to start with?
Sure. A question that was put in the chat a while ago. It's from John Abelson. CO2 sequestration will eventually saturate the geology around a given borehole. Will you comment on the need over time to drill a whole web of boreholes?
I'm going to say I don't have the technical background to address that question. And I don't know, Andrew, if you do.
Yeah, I don't know. And Pam has looked at some of these applications a little closer than I have. If they're not talking about a plan for additional boreholes, my understanding is that they make an application for a proposal that's something like 25 years long, and they propose wells, and those are the wells they're going to use. And if they wanted to do more wells, they would need to have a new application. So then I would propose, I would guess that they're just sticking with the same well from start to finish. So looking at about 25-year time horizons for injection.
There are characterization wells that are required up front, and then there is an identification of what's called an area of review and the pressure front that's identified, and what happens within those zones is strictly regulated. So I'm not sure that we fully understood the question, but
yeah.
Okay, I had a question text to me. Who makes up the EPA? Why is their foot dragging on their part?
The US EPA is in charge of the Class 6 permits, and those have. If the foot dragging is why those permits are taking a long time, well, I guess we don't fully know why they're getting delays. I know that they go back and forth with the applicant. There's a goal for all these permits to have them issued within 2 years. I don't think they're going to make it for a lot of those permits, as we're coming up on. When we started this work in the fall, we thought we would be at a hearing like today. It was like, early January was going to be the first hearings, and so the dates just slid back. So Pam, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
no, the only thing I would say is it's really technical stuff. So the EPA does have a whole set of folks that are qualified to review these applications, and as they go through them, they take the time to go back to the applicant and say, you didn't give me all you needed to say, in this area, or I have questions about X, Y, or Z. And so there's this back and forth that takes time. And I'm really hoping that it continues to take time, because it's too important to rush this through a process just because an operator is ready to go and wants to move forward. So I look at that as a good thing.
A follow-up to that was, why are they so late in noticing the problems and asking for mediation?
Well, I would say with ADM, they were not late in how do I say this, in recognizing they had a problem. You can read their reports. Their semi-annual reports are pretty darn detailed, and even their annual reports, they identified a leak as early as 2022. And they were contacting and working with the EPA. I think the better question is why did not the EPA issue the notice of violation when they realized they were having such problems with the well? They had to plug it and shut it down, essentially take it out of production. And that's a big question that we have and have raised. And why didn't they make it available? Let the public know. I mean, the fact is, it was a whistleblower, and I don't know if people realize this. Because of the story that broke in September, that was because a whistleblower identified the ADM's leak to a journalist, and that's when it came out. Why is that? I can only speculate.
Okay.
I just want to offer one thing, which I think maybe doesn't answer the question, but in terms of protections, we've been talking about the sole source designation. And what's interesting is while that sole source designation and what it means is very valuable for this effort, what it does is nothing for us, actually. The sole source, there are some additional protections that get triggered when a sole source aquifer is involved, and those get triggered when federal funds are involved. But we're giving these companies tax credits. We're not giving them federal funds, and therefore the sole source designation doesn't provide any regulatory benefit for the Mahomet in this case.
Okay, thank you. What are the other options for CCS? For example, other locations or capturing technologies?
Well, there are other locations, and I think if Andrew would pull the map up again, I don't know that we need to, but if you have it in your mind, you can see the Illinois Basin in general, which it covers a good part of our state, right? Has been determined to have the geology to be able to sequester CO2. I think the thickness of the Mount Simon Formation as it sits under the Mahomet Aquifer, especially on the east end, makes it more attractive. It could be a capacity thing. I don't really know that for sure, but they don't have to do it in the aquifer footprint. That's I think something important to know. Other options for CCS, Andrew and I would say to you, I think, that we worked together on a groundbreaking climate bill here in Illinois that really incentivizes and puts in place a whole host of other options besides this technology. And I believe that this technology is expensive, it's not proven, it's risky, it requires a lot of water, and it's diverting our time and our money from a suite of options that we know work and should be putting in place now. So, but the reality is it's here, industry's here, and we have to find ways to regulate it as safely as we can.
Yeah. CO2 for CO2, I think there are other options that we would like to see in terms of getting the same amount of reductions. A lot of this is going right now, it's going to be on fossil fuel power plants as a way to justify operating the power plants longer. It may not capture all the CO2 coming out of those plants. And so actually that's some analyses say we're going to end up with more carbon by putting capture on these because they only capture X amount, and we'll run them for longer because of that carbon capture technology. You also have, they're on ethanol. This is ethanol's big lifeline for going forward. And so this is a double down on the ethanol economy, which some may be favorable to, but I think has a lot of problems and has caused a lot of environmental damage. So there's a large, if your goal is pure carbon reduction, the conversation is just much broader, and there's a lot of alternatives that you would want to consider.
Okay. And I just want to add to that, it is ethanol today, but it is 2 coal plants in the state of Illinois that are being well, one of them has a pilot project that would be City Water Light and Power in Springfield, and is actively moving forward towards sequestration. That's a coal plant, and the other one is in St. Clair County, southwest part of the state, happens to be the largest emitter of CO2 in the country. So we're seeing ethanol first because it's the easiest thing to do. It's the cheapest way to go. And I think we all ought to know that there's gas power plants, one also in south of Springfield that's going to do CCS, and the two plants I talked about here, as well as because we're a hydrogen hub here in Illinois, and we received $1 billion from the federal government to partner with Indiana and Michigan for that purpose. I think we're going to potentially be seeing industries relocate here to take advantage of the ability to to store CO2 in the geology that we have, or pipe it in. So it's ethanol today, but it's not. It's going to move from that if it stays alive. And to answer a question that was raised earlier, somebody asked about the freeze, or maybe Andrew, you brought it up. It's really going to be interesting to see what happens with the Trump administration and how they look at the budget reconciliation process and what they might be cutting in addition to clean energy. Will this stand up? Will CCS stand up? Most of us think it will, but we don't know that for sure, right? So we all need to pay close attention as to what happens in the next several months in that process, to try to find out again points that we can engage and make sure the kinds of incentives that we need to bring out a clean energy economy stay there, and the things that are causing harm and concern are cut.
Okay, another question. It seems inevitable that there will be a carbon leak in the plumbing based on past history. What would ensure that 25 years without leaks is even possible?
Longer than 25 years. It's forever, right? So the research says that at some point the carbon becomes stable or solidifies, but we're talking long time horizons. So it's not 25 years. It's forever. If their plan is to, if we're going to pay them to store our carbon, if we're going to pay them $85 a ton to not emit, they better at least be storing it permanently. But yeah, that's the time horizon that they have to succeed under.
And again, we have all those human errors, the material failures, the design failures we talked about. That's a great question. What makes them think it can happen as long as we need to? I don't know.
Any more questions?
Carol's on mute.
One more, Teresa. Were the environmental impacts of the two leaks quantified? For example, a financial impact was the $10,000 cost of replacement water.
That is what I referred to as the People's Gas leak, and that was a 2020 estimate. And the state of Illinois, I think legislatively approved like $3,800 of that amount. I think if you talk to Senator Rose, he would say that money has not yet been appropriated, which hasn't helped those who are without a new water supply. I mean, they're receiving bottled water, but that's different than being hooked up to a water supply. That's not of any consolation to them.
Pam's talking about the People's Gas leak, and
People's
it's
Gas.
clear if Dave was
Yep.
asking about the impact of People's Gas or if
the two leaks.
The two leaks makes you think the question's about ADM.
The questions about ADM, no, I don't believe that was no. But again, I want to emphasize ADM's leak was small. ADM's leak has not contaminated any water. ADM yet. And I have questions about that. The thing that I would like to see is a third party get involved and look at this issue, rather than have ADM do its own modeling and report back to the US EPA. That would be a request I would like to make of the EPA, and I hope to be meeting with them about some other issues in the future. So, but at any rate, no, there's been no quantification because there's been no leak, no water contaminated.
I guess since it's 1 minute of, any question would take us beyond. Thank you so much to our panelists for your time. I hope this encourages a lot of people to come out tomorrow night because it's terribly, terribly important. And I feel so fortunate we were able to have you tonight as our speakers with this very just urgently important topic. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Pam. And thank you, everybody who came from many other counties besides Champaign County, I think.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.